The foundations of a slow unraveling. Iran's contemporary crisis did not begin with a single protest, a single sanction, or a single foreign confrontation. It is the cumulative result of decades of structural contradictions embedded deep within the Islamic Republic's political, economic, and social systems. To understand why many analysts now speak of Iran's slow, seemingly inevitable march toward collapse, one must first understand how the foundations of the state were constructed and where they began to crack. Collapse, in this context, does not necessarily mean sudden revolution or instant regime change. Instead, it refers to a gradual erosion of legitimacy, capacity, and cohesion, where the state continues to exist but becomes increasingly unable to govern effectively, provide stability, or command genuine loyalty from its population. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born out of revolution in 1979, overthrowing a monarchy that had become disconnected from its people and overly dependent on foreign powers. In its early years, the new regime enjoyed broad popular support, rooted in religious legitimacy, anti-imperialist sentiment, and promises of social justice. The system that emerged combined elements of republican governance, elections, a parliament, a president, with an unelected clerical authority centered around the supreme leader. This hybrid model was designed to balance popular participation with ideological control. Over time, however, that balance shifted decisively away from the public and toward a narrow elite, creating a system that demands loyalty without offering accountability. One of the most critical weaknesses of the Iranian state lies in its political structure. While elections still take place, their credibility has steadily declined. Candidates are routinely disqualified. Voter turnout has fallen to historic lows, and key decisions are made by institutions that are not answerable to the electorate. For many Iranians, especially the younger generation, the idea that they can meaningfully influence the direction of their country through legal political channels feels increasingly hollow. When peaceful participation loses its value, frustration does not disappear, it accumulates. This growing disconnect between state and society forms the first pillar of long-term instability. Economic mismanagement compounds this political crisis. Iran is a country rich in natural resources, with vast oil and gas reserves, a well-educated population, and strategic geography, yet it consistently underperforms economically. Sanctions have undoubtedly played a major role in constraining growth, limiting access to global markets, and devaluing the national currency. But sanctions alone do not explain the depth of Iran's economic dysfunction. Corruption, patronage networks, and the dominance of semi-state institutions, particularly those linked to the Revolutionary Guards, have distorted the economy from within. Large segments of economic activity operate beyond transparency or competition, discouraging private investment and innovation. Inflation has become a constant feature of daily life for ordinary Iranians. The national currency has lost much of its value. Wages have failed to keep pace with rising costs, and basic necessities have become increasingly unaffordable. For years, the government has relied on short-term fixes, subsidies, cash handouts, and price controls. These measures provide temporary relief, but deepen structural problems in the long run. An economy that cannot deliver stability or opportunity gradually erodes public trust, especially when citizens see elites insulated from the consequences of failure. Demographics add another layer of pressure. Iran is a young country, with a large proportion of its population born long after the 1979 revolution. This generation does not share the same emotional attachment to revolutionary ideals or memories of existential threats that once unified the nation. Instead, they are globally connected, digitally aware, and acutely conscious of the gap between their aspirations and their realities. Education levels have risen, but employment opportunities have not kept pace. The result is a generation that feels overqualified, underpaid, and unheard. History shows that such demographic imbalances are not easily contained indefinitely. Social control has become the regime's primary response to these mounting pressures. Restrictions on expression, dress, media, and digital access are enforced in the name of ideological preservation and national security, yet repression, while effective in the short term, carries long-term costs. Every crackdown widens the emotional distance between state and society. Every silenced voice becomes a private grievance. Over time, fear may prevent immediate rebellion, but it cannot restore legitimacy. A system that relies increasingly on coercion reveals its own insecurity. The role of the security apparatus, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is central to this dynamic. Originally created to defend the revolution, the Guards have evolved into a powerful political and economic actor. They control key industries, influence foreign policy, and act as an internal security force. This concentration of power creates a paradox. On one hand, it strengthens the regime's ability to suppress dissent. On the other, it ties the survival of the state to a single institution with its own interests, incentives, and worldview. As the guards become more entrenched, flexibility decreases, and the system becomes less capable of adapting to change. Foreign policy further strains the system. Iran's leadership has long pursued regional influence as a means of deterrence and ideological projection. While this strategy has expanded Tehran's reach, it has also come at a significant cost. Financial resources are diverted abroad while domestic needs go unmet. International isolation deepens, sanctions tighten, and ordinary citizens bear the consequences. For many Iranians, the promise of regional power rings hollow when contrasted with declining living standards at home. This gap between official rhetoric and lived reality feeds cynicism and resentment. Another often overlooked factor is environmental stress. Water shortages, air pollution, and climate-related challenges have intensified in recent years. Poor management and outdated infrastructure have worsened natural constraints, turning environmental issues into social and political ones. Protests over water access and agricultural collapse demonstrate how ecological stress can intersect with economic hardship and political dissatisfaction. These are not abstract future threats. They are present realities that place additional strain on an already fragile system. What makes Iran's situation particularly precarious is the convergence of these pressures. Political exclusion, economic stagnation, demographic frustration, social repression, regional overreach, and environmental stress are not isolated problems. They reinforce one another. Economic hardship amplifies political anger. Political rigidity prevents reform. Repression fuels social alienation. Foreign pressure limits economic recovery. Each failed response narrows the range of available options, pushing the system further down a path of gradual decay. It is important to emphasize that collapse, if it comes, is unlikely to be sudden. The Iranian state still possesses significant tools of control, loyal institutions, and strategic depth. However, history suggests that states do not fail only when they lose power. They fail when they lose legitimacy and adaptability. Iran's current trajectory suggests a system increasingly focused on survival rather than renewal. When a government prioritizes control over consent, stability becomes brittle rather than resilient. In this first part, we have examined the deep structural foundations underlying Iran's ongoing crisis. These foundations did not crack overnight, and they will not fully break tomorrow. But the direction of movement matters. The slow, grinding nature of decline often goes unnoticed until it reaches a tipping point. In the next part, we will explore how repeated waves of protest, state responses, and internal fractures are accelerating this process, and why each cycle leaves the system weaker than before. Protest cycles, state repression, and the deepening legitimacy crisis. If the structural weaknesses of the Iranian state form the foundation of its long-term decline, then repeated cycles of protest and repression are the forces accelerating that decline. Over the past decade, Iran has experienced wave after wave of unrest, each sparked by different triggers, but all rooted in the same unresolved grievances. What makes these cycles so significant is not simply that they occur, but that each one leaves the system weaker, more rigid, and more alienated from its own society than before. Rather than acting as pressure valves that allow limited reform or renewal, protests in Iran have become stress tests that expose how little room for adaptation the political system now possesses. Early protests in the Islamic Republic were often ideological or factional, emerging from disputes within the system itself. In contrast, recent movements have been broad-based, leaderless, and socially diverse. Workers, students, women, ethnic minorities, small business owners, and even segments of the middle class have all taken part at different times. These protests are not driven by a single political party or figure, which makes them harder to co-opt or dismantle. They reflect a society that no longer sees meaningful distinction between competing elites and instead directs its anger toward the system as a whole. Economic shocks have repeatedly served as the spark. Sudden fuel price hikes, subsidy cuts, currency collapses, and rising food costs have pushed people into the streets. Yet economic pain alone does not explain the intensity or persistence of the protests. What transforms hardship into rebellion is the widespread belief that suffering is unnecessary, mismanaged, and unfairly distributed. When citizens perceive that corruption, ideological priorities, or foreign adventures take precedence over their basic welfare, anger becomes moral rather than merely material. At that point, repression does not restore order. It deepens resentment. The state's response to unrest has followed a familiar pattern: force, arrests, media blackouts, and denial. Security forces move quickly to contain demonstrations. Internet access is restricted to prevent coordination, and official narratives frame protesters as foreign-backed or misguided. In the short term, this approach has proven effective. Streets are cleared, leaders, where identifiable, are detained, and visible dissent subsides. But this apparent stability is deceptive. Beneath the surface, each crackdown erodes the regime's remaining legitimacy, particularly among those who were once neutral or politically disengaged. One of the most significant shifts in recent years has been the erosion of fear as a controlling mechanism. While fear still exists, it no longer guarantees compliance. Many protesters are acutely aware of the risks they face, yet choose to participate anyway. This signals a dangerous threshold for any authoritarian system, when citizens begin to perceive the status quo as more intolerable than the dangers of resistance. Such a mindset does not emerge suddenly. It is the product of repeated disappointment, broken promises, and lived experience. Women have played a particularly visible role in this transformation. Restrictions on personal freedom, enforced through moral policing and legal codes, have become symbols of broader state intrusion into private life. When protests center on dignity, bodily autonomy, and everyday freedoms, they resonate across social classes and age groups. These are not abstract political demands. They are deeply personal grievances that touch daily existence. By responding with force rather than reform, the state signals that it views control as more important than consent, reinforcing the very anger it seeks to suppress. Ethnic and regional dynamics further complicate the picture. Protests in peripheral provinces, often among ethnic minorities, frequently intersect with economic neglect and environmental hardship. These regions tend to experience higher unemployment, weaker infrastructure, and harsher security responses. When grievances in these areas are met primarily with coercion, feelings of marginalization intensify. While Iran has not seen sustained separatist movements on a large scale, persistent regional unrest chips away at national cohesion and stretches security resources thinner over time. The judiciary and legal system, rather than acting as mediators or sources of accountability, are widely perceived as extensions of political power. Mass trials, harsh sentences, and limited due process reinforce the belief that the law exists to protect the state, not the citizen. This perception undermines one of the last pillars of institutional trust. When people no longer believe that grievances can be resolved through legal channels, the appeal of confrontation grows, even if success seems unlikely. Internal fractures within the elite also play a critical role. While outward unity is maintained, tensions between factions, institutions, and personalities are increasingly visible. Disagreements over economic policy, foreign strategy, and succession issues create uncertainty at the top. Importantly, these divisions rarely translate into meaningful reform because the cost of compromise is perceived as existential. Any concession is feared as a sign of weakness that could invite further demands. As a result, elites often choose rigidity over adaptation, even when they recognize the risks of stagnation. The issue of succession looms quietly but heavily over the system. Uncertainty about future leadership creates incentives for consolidation rather than experimentation. Institutions compete to secure their positions in a post-transition landscape, leading to greater centralization of power and reduced tolerance for dissent. In such an environment, long-term problem-solving takes a back seat to short-term survival. This dynamic further disconnects leadership from the realities faced by the population. International pressure interacts with domestic unrest in complex ways. Sanctions and diplomatic isolation are used by authorities to rally nationalist sentiment and blame external enemies. While this strategy retains some effectiveness, it is far less persuasive than in the past. Many citizens distinguish between external pressure and internal responsibility, and when leaders appear unwilling to adjust policies that provoke isolation, public patience wears thin. National pride cannot indefinitely compensate for empty wallets and restricted lives. Media control and information management, once powerful tools, are also losing effectiveness. Despite censorship, alternative narratives circulate through informal networks, satellite channels, and digital platforms. Even when access is restricted, people find ways to share experiences and images. This constant flow of information undermines official versions of events and reinforces shared grievances. A state that cannot fully control the story struggles to control perceptions, especially among younger, tech-savvy generations. What emerges from these cycles is a legitimacy crisis that cannot be solved through force alone. Legitimacy is not merely about maintaining order. It is about convincing people that the system deserves obedience. In Iran's case, obedience is increasingly enforced rather than earned. Each protest may be suppressed, but the underlying causes remain unresolved. Each crackdown may restore calm, but at the cost of further alienation. Over time, this creates a brittle form of stability, one that appears solid until it suddenly fractures. Historical comparisons suggest that regimes often underestimate the cumulative effect of repeated unrest. Leaders may interpret survival after each crisis as proof of resilience, when in reality it signals delayed consequences. The danger lies not in any single protest, but in the normalization of protest as a recurring feature of political life. When unrest becomes routine, it indicates a systemic failure to integrate society into governance. In the second part, we have examined how cycles of protest and repression are accelerating Iran's slow decline. These cycles do not bring immediate collapse, but they steadily hollow out the system from within. In the next part, we will turn our focus inward to the state itself and analyze how institutional decay, elite fragmentation, and economic exhaustion are converging to further weaken Iran's capacity to govern and adapt. Institutional decay, elite fragmentation, and the limits of state capacity. While cycles of protest and repression expose the immediate tensions between Iranian society and its leadership, the deeper threat to the Islamic Republic lies in the internal erosion of its own institutions. A state is not merely a collection of policies or leaders. It is a network of institutions that provide governance, enforce laws, manage resources, and maintain legitimacy. When these institutions weaken, the state loses the ability to respond effectively to crises, adapt to change, or sustain its authority. In Iran, institutional decay has been accelerating for years, quietly undermining the state's capacity even as its leadership continues to project an image of strength. At the heart of Iran's institutional fragility is the concentration of power around the supreme leader and a narrow elite. While centralized authority can provide decisive action, it also reduces institutional flexibility. Key decisions are often made in closed circles, bypassing traditional bureaucracies or technocratic expertise. Ministries and agencies that should operate independently are subordinated to ideological priorities or personal loyalty networks. Over time, this dynamic discourages professional competence and fosters a culture where survival depends more on allegiance than on effectiveness. The judiciary offers a clear illustration of this problem. In theory, the judiciary should act as a check on power, enforce laws impartially, and protect citizens' rights. In practice, it functions primarily as a tool of political control. High-profile trials of protesters, dissidents, and journalists are often conducted with minimal transparency or due process. Lower-level judicial officials are incentivized to follow political directives rather than uphold the law. As a result, the judiciary's credibility has eroded, and citizens increasingly view it as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Economic institutions have experienced a similar fate. While Iran possesses vast natural resources and a skilled workforce, economic governance has been repeatedly undermined by patronage, corruption, and politicization. State-owned enterprises and Revolutionary Guard-affiliated conglomerates dominate key sectors, creating monopolistic structures that stifle competition. Investment decisions are influenced more by political loyalty than market logic, and regulatory frameworks are inconsistently applied. Even when the state implements reforms or introduces economic stimulus measures, the results are often uneven, mismanaged, or diverted toward elite interests. Over time, this reduces the government's ability to deliver public goods and erodes confidence in its competence. Elite fragmentation compounds institutional decay. Far from a unified ruling class, Iran's leadership consists of multiple factions with competing priorities. Conservatives, pragmatists, hardliners, clerics, and Revolutionary Guard commanders all vie for influence, often pursuing conflicting agendas. While these factions occasionally cooperate to maintain stability, internal competition frequently hinders coordinated policymaking. Disagreements over economic strategy, foreign policy, and succession planning generate paralysis at critical moments. When the system is rigid enough that compromise is perceived as weakness, institutional decision-making suffers, leaving the state reactive rather than proactive. The Revolutionary Guard exemplifies both strength and a source of systemic vulnerability. As the most powerful military and economic actor in the country, the Guard protects the regime from internal and external threats, while generating significant revenue through commercial enterprises. However, its dominance also creates a paradox. The survival of the state becomes increasingly dependent on a single institution with its own agenda. When the Guard's priorities diverge from those of civilian institutions or the broader population, conflict or mismanagement can emerge. Moreover, this concentration of power reduces redundancy in governance, meaning fewer actors are capable of responding effectively when crises occur. Iran's capacity for adaptation is further constrained by generational dynamics within the elite. Leadership positions are increasingly filled by individuals who rose to power during periods of crisis, where survival skills and ideological loyalty were valued above innovation or strategic thinking. While these leaders may be effective at suppressing dissent, they are often ill-equipped to address complex, long-term challenges such as economic modernization, environmental degradation, or demographic pressures. A system dominated by crisis-trained leaders tends to perpetuate short-term fixes rather than sustainable solutions, further accelerating institutional erosion. Environmental stress amplifies these institutional weaknesses. Iran faces severe water scarcity, soil degradation, and air pollution, challenges compounded by mismanagement and infrastructural neglect. Addressing these crises requires coordination across multiple agencies, significant investment, and long-term planning. Yet fragmented institutions and a rigid decision-making hierarchy often result in delayed responses, inadequate solutions, or projects that serve political rather than practical purposes. These failures are increasingly visible to the public, reinforcing perceptions of incompetence and fueling social discontent. External pressures interact with institutional fragility in complex ways. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and regional conflicts force the state to allocate resources to military and strategic priorities at the expense of domestic needs. This diversion of attention and funding magnifies existing inefficiencies and limits the government's ability to respond to internal crises. Furthermore, reliance on confrontational foreign policy as a source of domestic legitimacy becomes increasingly tenuous when economic hardships, environmental degradation, and social unrest dominate daily life. Citizens are less likely to accept sacrifices for abstract geopolitical goals when they perceive domestic mismanagement as the real source of suffering. A critical consequence of institutional decay is the gradual erosion of legitimacy. Legitimacy depends on both performance and consent. A state must be able to govern effectively and convince its population that it has the right to do so. Iran's institutions increasingly fail on both counts. Economic mismanagement reduces the state's ability to deliver essential services. Political repression and elite competition undermine the perception that governance is fair or accountable. Environmental and infrastructural failures reinforce the sense that institutions are incapable of safeguarding the public's well-being. Each failed performance erodes public trust, and with legitimacy declining, coercion becomes the primary tool of governance. The cyclical nature of protest, repression, and institutional failure creates a feedback loop that intensifies the state's vulnerabilities. Each wave of unrest exposes institutional weaknesses. Each repressive response further alienates the population. Each failed policy undermines competence and credibility. Over time, this loop makes systemic adaptation more difficult, even as external pressures and internal grievances mount. The state becomes trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of instability, capable of short-term survival, but increasingly incapable of long-term governance. Succession uncertainty remains another latent but potent source of fragility. While the supreme leader maintains formal authority, questions about the future of leadership loom large. The system lacks transparent or widely accepted mechanisms for succession, generating intense behind-the-scenes jockeying among factions. This uncertainty incentivizes consolidation and risk aversion, discouraging meaningful reform. At the same time, elite competition around succession can undermine coordination, create contradictory policies, and exacerbate institutional paralysis. In essence, the system becomes preoccupied with preserving itself, rather than addressing the structural causes of decline. Historical parallels illuminate the risks inherent in this pattern. Other states that relied heavily on centralized authority, coercive enforcement, and elite factionalism have often experienced gradual erosion rather than sudden collapse. In these cases, the system survives for years or decades, but its capacity to provide public goods, maintain legitimacy, or adapt to new challenges steadily diminishes. The analogy is instructive for Iran. Even if immediate regime change does not occur, slow decay can produce a state that exists in form but not in function, increasingly incapable of meeting the needs of its population. Institutional decay also limits Iran's ability to respond to external crises. Natural disasters, military conflicts, or economic shocks require coordinated, effective responses. Fragmented institutions, rigid hierarchies, and elite competition hinder the state's capacity to mobilize resources, coordinate agencies, or make informed decisions under pressure. As a result, crises that might be manageable in a robust state become compounded in a weakened one. The longer such vulnerabilities persist, the more likely a seemingly minor event could trigger systemic failure or sudden instability. Finally, the combination of institutional decay, elite fragmentation, and public discontent generates a profound strategic dilemma for the leadership. Maintaining control requires both coercion and legitimacy, yet each tool undermines the other over time. Excessive repression alienates citizens and international actors, while efforts at reform risk signaling weakness or inviting further demands. In such a context, the leadership is trapped. Any policy choice carries significant risk, and inaction erodes authority even as action generates resistance. This strategic impasse accelerates decline, not because of any single failure, but because the system becomes increasingly incapable of navigating complex social, economic, and political realities. In this third part, we have traced how institutional decay and elite fragmentation interact with cycles of protest, repression, and public discontent to further weaken Iran's state capacity. Structural inefficiencies, corruption, and rigid hierarchies reduce the government's ability to deliver services or adapt to change. Factional competition and succession uncertainty amplify paralysis. Environmental, demographic, and economic pressures compound these challenges. Together, these factors create a state that, while not collapsing in an instant, is progressively losing its ability to govern effectively. In the final part, we will examine the potential outcomes of this trajectory, including the implications for domestic stability, regional security, and the broader question of whether Iran's slow march toward collapse can be reversed, or if it is truly inevitable. The inevitable crossroads: collapse, adaptation, or prolonged stagnation. As we arrive at the final stage of this analysis, it becomes clear that Iran stands at a crossroads. The convergence of structural weaknesses, persistent unrest, institutional decay, and elite fragmentation has placed the country on a trajectory that, while slow, appears increasingly difficult to reverse. The question now is not whether the Islamic Republic can face immediate collapse, its survival mechanisms remain formidable, but whether it can adapt, reform, and restore legitimacy before the cumulative pressures overwhelm it. The next decades will determine whether Iran achieves stabilization through meaningful change, slides into prolonged stagnation, or experiences a more dramatic systemic breakdown. One potential outcome is continued incremental decline. The state may survive, but its capacity to govern effectively will remain compromised. In such a scenario, coercion becomes the default tool of governance, legitimacy continues to erode, and public life is characterized by frustration, resentment, and episodic unrest. Economic stagnation will persist, resources will be mismanaged, and regional ambitions will increasingly clash with domestic needs. This form of slow-motion decline mirrors historical examples where regimes survive in name but fail in function, creating societies trapped in cycles of hardship, alienation, and unfulfilled potential. Citizens endure, protest when possible, and adapt to scarcity, but the overall trajectory of the state remains downward. Alternatively, Iran could attempt a process of internal adaptation. This would require genuine reform across political, economic, and social spheres. Political reform would need to increase accountability, broaden participation, and restore legitimacy. Economic reform would involve dismantling monopolistic structures, improving transparency, and stimulating growth through innovation rather than coercion. Social reform would require a reevaluation of restrictions on personal freedoms and a more constructive engagement with public grievances. The difficulty of this path is monumental. It demands not just technical solutions, but a fundamental rethinking of power, priorities, and ideology. Resistance from entrenched elites, conservative factions, and ideological hardliners presents a formidable barrier. Moreover, the window for reform narrows with each protest cycle, each economic shock, and each failed policy, as public trust continues to erode. A third potential path is accelerated collapse, a more sudden, if still uneven, unraveling. While Iran's state apparatus remains powerful, certain catalysts could trigger rapid destabilization. These include severe economic shocks, large-scale environmental disasters, significant military defeat, or a coordinated wave of social unrest that overwhelms security forces. In such a scenario, the collapse would not necessarily be instantaneous. It could occur as a cascading series of institutional failures, elite defections, and regional power vacuums. Historical examples demonstrate that even a state with extensive control mechanisms can be vulnerable when multiple pressures converge faster than the system can respond. Iran's heavy reliance on the Revolutionary Guard, centralization of authority, and weak institutional redundancy increase its vulnerability to such cascading failures. Regional and global dynamics further complicate the picture. Iran is not isolated. Its economic, military, and political calculations are deeply influenced by neighbors, superpowers, and international institutions. External pressure can exacerbate internal instability by limiting resources, imposing sanctions, and constraining foreign trade. Conversely, engagement and diplomacy can provide relief and create space for internal reform. The interplay between domestic fragility and international constraints is a delicate balance. Missteps in foreign policy, whether excessive militarization, failed negotiations, or overreach in proxy conflicts, could amplify internal pressures, while strategic engagement might create breathing room to address systemic weaknesses. The leadership's ability to navigate these external pressures will significantly influence which of the three paths, stagnation, adaptation, or collapse, Iran ultimately follows. Demographics remain a critical factor in determining outcomes. Iran's population is relatively young, urbanized, and digitally connected. These attributes increase the potential for sustained civic engagement and organized protest. A younger population that is increasingly aware of its economic and political marginalization represents both a challenge and an opportunity. Failure to integrate youth into governance, employment, and social frameworks intensifies unrest. Conversely, meaningful avenues for participation and advancement could stabilize society over time. The demographic clock is ticking. Each year that frustration remains unaddressed, the risk of mass mobilization grows, particularly when coupled with economic shocks or environmental crises. Environmental and resource pressures are another looming challenge. Water scarcity, desertification, pollution, and climate-induced stress on agriculture threaten to compound social and economic tensions. Environmental crises do not respect political boundaries and require coordinated, competent, and transparent institutional responses. Iran's track record in these areas has been inconsistent, and institutions strained by political and economic dysfunction may struggle to mitigate these challenges effectively. Environmental degradation is not just a natural concern. It has direct political and social implications, influencing migration, agricultural production, urbanization, and social unrest. Even in the absence of dramatic collapse, the interplay of these pressures signals that the next decades will be defined by instability unless proactive measures are taken. The regime's legitimacy crisis is not a theoretical concern. It manifests in protests, declining political participation, public skepticism, and emigration. The state's capacity for adaptation is eroding due to rigid hierarchies, elite competition, and a failure to address structural problems. Economic mismanagement, environmental degradation, and demographic pressures intersect to create a compound crisis, one that is easier to accelerate than to reverse. A critical insight from studying Iran's trajectory is that slow decline is both cumulative and self-reinforcing. Each protest weakens legitimacy. Each failed reform erodes confidence. Each repression cycle amplifies resentment. These processes are nonlinear, meaning that periods of apparent calm can precede rapid escalation. The system's fragility is therefore not always apparent until a tipping point is reached. While the Islamic Republic has survived crises in the past, the convergence of pressures today is unprecedented in both scale and complexity. The next decade could witness either a managed adaptation, a drawn-out stagnation, or a sudden unraveling that reshapes Iran and its region.